Okay, the webinar has started and the room is filling. And hi, I'm Walter Gordon. I'm chairman of the AIAA Niagara Frontier Section that kind of put these three esteemed gentlemen together. And without any further delay, I'm going to introduce Dr. Christopher Scolese, director of the National Reconnaissance Office and past director of NASA Goddard, who's going to give us a brief perspective from when he was in that office. Dr. Scalise, it's all yours.
Winter. It's great to be here on the 100th anniversary of the launching of the first successful liquid fueled rocket. And I'm sure many of the people on this webinar realize that the Goddard Space Flight Center was the first new center that NASA created in 1959. Or thereabouts. And I was fortunate enough to be there for the 60th anniversary and several others as the director of the center. So it was quite a thing to be there for to celebrate all the great accomplishments that Goddard did in space science and earth science and astrophysics and planetary. And of course, it had its contributions to the human spaceflight program as well. I'm sure you also know that as part of the Goddard Space Flight Center is the Wallops Flight Facility, where we actually launch rockets, liquid fuel rockets, as well as solids. So continuing in the tradition of Robert H. Goddard, we're not only going to space, but we're also launching liquid fuel rockets. Goddard has a long history. I'm sure Bill Barry can talk about it, but you don't want to hear about the Space Flight Center. You want to hear about Robert Goddard. Bill has been the NASA historian for I forget how many years, Bill, but he has done just an incredible job of cataloging many of the great successes of NASA. So I will now turn it over to Bill for him to tell us about Robert Goddard. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it was 10 years as chief historian, so that's uh, that's the longest I've ever had any one job in my life, actually. So I guess I like that one. Chris, it's a pleasure to see you again. And I'll take this opportunity to say thanks again for your strong support for government history programs. In a democracy, it's vitally important that citizens know what their government's doing. And the historians play a small, but I think vital part in helping us get to the truth of what's going on or what has happened. Everybody else who's online here, I wish you good evening and greetings from Western Massachusetts, where I happen to be on this Zoom call. I wish you all the best on this important day, the 100th anniversary of Robert Goddard's first liquid fuel rocket launch. That event actually happened just some 50 miles due east of where I'm sitting now, just outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. In addition to introducing our keynote speaker tonight, I've also been asked to give you an overview of how the historical perception of Goddard has evolved over this last century. You've probably seen at least some of the recent coverage in the centennial in the press or online or in social media. And the storyline is remarkably consistent. For example, on NASA's website, Goddard is called the father of modern rocketry. And they also note that, quote, recognition was slow to arrive, ridicule came faster. In an op-ed in the AIAA's Aerospace America published last week, Alan Stern says, quote, it is profoundly regrettable that the import of Dr. Goddard's pioneering efforts in rocket propulsion was largely unappreciated before his passing in 1945. In fact, I think if we look back on what we've heard about Robert Goddard, the general impression you probably have, if you're like me, is of a brilliant, maybe slightly absent-minded professor and inventor, one who persevered in the face of unfair ridicule and maybe, as a result of being a bit shy and sensitive, died largely unknown and unrecognized for his accomplishments. And only when the space age came upon us did he finally get the recognition that he was due. Those of you like me who grew up during the early days of the space race probably remember the burst of publicity about Goddard at the dawn of the 1960s. Being a young space addict myself at the time, I remember being thrilled to discover a copy of the book This High Man on the shelves of my local library. This High Man was a 1963 biography of Goddard by a guy named Milton Lehman, and it was the first book-length treatment of Goddard's life and accomplishments. That book solidified the storyline about the unappreciated father of rocketry that we're all so familiar with. But this long-lasting image of Goddard is a result of the perseverance of another person named Goddard, his wife, Esther. Because following Robert Goddard's death in 1945, she continued her long-standing job as his key support staff person and cheerleader. With the support of the Guggenheim Foundation, which had funded much of his research, Esther systematically assembled patent applications based on her husband's work. When he died, Goddard had 83 patents to his name. By the time Esther was done a few years later, he had 214. And as a number of people have noted, it's virtually impossible to do any rocket work in the United States without infringing on one or more of Goddard's patents. Now, in 1951, along with the Guggenheim Foundation, Esther Goddard filed suit against the U.S. government for patent infringement. It took almost 10 years, but in 1960, the U.S. government agreed to pay $1 million to the foundation and to Mrs. Goddard for infringement, and also as a license fee for all future uses of the Goddard patented technology. A settlement in this case was probably inevitable at that point because following Sputnik, Goddard became the homegrown rocket hero that America wanted. For example, in 1958, the National Space Club, known then as the National Rocket Club, held its first Goddard Memorial Dinner. Now, this is a black tie event that continues to this day. Now it's known colloquially in the business as Space Prom. And at that first dinner, the first Goddard Memorial Trophy was awarded to Wernher von Braun, with the award being presented by Mrs. Esther Goddard herself. The next year, in 1959, brought a cascade of awards, events, and honors for Robert Goddard. On May 1st, 1959, NASA announced that its first space center, as Chris mentioned, would be named in his honor. On September 16th, 1959, Congress passed legislation awarding Goddard the Congressional Gold Medal. The next June, the Smithsonian awarded Goddard its highest recognition, the Langley Medal, to Goddard. It seemed like everyone was getting in on the act. In fact, my old alma mater, the U.S. Air Force Academy, graduated its first class in 1959 and began a tradition of presenting the Goddard Trophy to the top student in math. That still continues to this day. I have to note here that Goddard was a historian's dream, right? He kept extensive diaries, notes about his work, and all of his voluminous correspondence. Most of this had been organized for him throughout his life by Esther. So it's perhaps not surprising that starting in 1958, she set to work organizing his papers for deposit at the Library of Congress. She did two other important things with those papers. First, she gave Milton Lehman exclusive access to some of Robert Goddard's papers for what was to be the definitive biography, This High Man, the book I was so thrilled to read as a kid. She also set out on the huge project of publishing the papers of Robert Goddard. In the end, this wound up as a 1,700-page, 3-volume work that came out in 1970. As it turns out, Esther Goddard didn't deposit her husband's papers with the Library of Congress. In the end, she opted to leave the collection with Clark University in Worcester, Mass. Now, Goddard had done his master's and PhD at Clark and then served as a professor of physics there for many years. When Clark opened its new library in 1969, they named it in honor of Robert Goddard. And that seems to have won over Esther Goddard, and she deposited the collection of all of his papers and her papers there at Clark University. Now, the story of Robert Goddard, the misunderstood and unappreciated father of rocketry, a story shaped by his widow Esther, dominated the historical perspective for many years. In fact, it's still plainly evident today. You could see it in coverage of the centennial. But being the curious bunch they are, historians began to re-examine the data as soon as it was available. And perhaps ironically, the archive that Esther Goddard had preserved at Clark University proved to be a treasure trove of new insights. By the early 1980s, articles began to appear questioning Goddard's actual impact on rocket development in the U.S. The National Air and Space Museum's Frank Winter began at that point to publicly question whether Goddard actually deserved the title of father of rocketry. Others also pointed out that Goddard's penchant for secrecy and his limitations as an engineer and his approach to engineering greatly limited his influence on rocket development in the United States. These things meant that Goddard was more inspiration than architect when you think about U.S. rocketry, or at least that's the opinion of many historians that have since come out. And as time has gone on, historians have also called into question some of the other fundamentals from the 1960s Goddard story. For example, in his 2003 book, Rocket Man, David Clary points out that Goddard's reputation for avoiding the press is not really supported by the papers at Clark University. Clary suggests that Goddard may not have liked the press, and he may have been wary of the press, but he needed to engage with the press to secure funding for his work and also to ensure that his record of being the first man of rocketry was secured. To me, though, one of the most interesting articles of these re-examinations of Goddard's influence came out of research with the Goddard papers at Clark in a 2004 article by Asif Siddiqui. Now, Professor Siddiqui teaches now at Fordham University, but while he was working on his PhD, he found that Robert Goddard played a role in the birth of space and rocket enthusiasm in the early Soviet Union. It turns out that a false rumor that Goddard planned to launch a rocket to the moon on July 4th, 1924, galvanized rocket enthusiasts in the Soviet Union. This eventually led to the exchange of letters between Robert Goddard and several Soviet rocket enthusiasts and organizations, copies of which are in the collection at Clark University. Dr. Siddiqui notes that this suggests that Goddard was not so much publicity shy after all. And moreover, while Goddard probably didn't realize it, his influence moved the idea of spaceflight from what was considered a crackpot dream to a real prospect in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, with consequences that would come to fruition some 30 years later. Interesting. While historians have and probably will continue to reconsider the facts about Robert Goddard, his and Esther's meticulous record keeping means that there is no doubt about the fact that 100 years ago today, the first successful liquid-fueled rocket was launched on a farm near Worcester, Massachusetts. We even have pictures taken by Esther of Goddard standing by the rocket before launch. Tonight, we have the distinct honor of having an aerospace historian of the first rank, Dr. Richard Hallion, to tell us about Goddard and his achievements. Now, those of you who attend AIAA Niagara Frontier Section events regularly may recall that I had the honor of introducing Dr. Hallion a couple of years ago when he was the keynote speaker at the 75th anniversary of the Bell X-1 breaking the sound barrier. At that time, I pointed out that Dick Hallion was the perfect person to talk about the X-1 because of his lifelong interest in supersonic flight. In fact, that was the topic of his first book, published in 1977, before he'd even finished grad school. Now, you may be surprised to hear that his interest in Robert Goddard goes back just as far. In fact, his second book, Legacy of Flight, The Guggenheim Contribution to American Aviation, was published the same year, 1977. I'm still trying to figure out how a history grad student gets two books published in 1 year. Maybe Dick can explain it to us someday. But as you may have already noticed, the name Guggenheim comes up a lot in the Goddard story. And it was also part of Dick's book to talk about the Guggenheim investment in Goddard's research. A book, by the way, that I will note won the AIAA History Manuscript Award in 1976. So we are once again blessed with a keynote speaker with a deep historical interest and a personal connection to the topic. And there's no better historian to help us gain new insight into Robert Hutchings Goddard on the centennial of this landmark event. So it's my privilege and pleasure to give you Dr. Richard Hallion.
Bill, thanks so much for that introduction. I feel embarrassed by it, actually. I would say that your presentation raised some very important issues that have to be considered with regard to Goddard, namely his actual influence on the craft of rocketry and astronautics. And I think the overall judgment that perhaps Goddard's greatest influence was in the popularization of spaceflight and the making of spaceflight as scientifically respectable. I think that that's perhaps still true. But I would argue as well that if we take a look technically at what Goddard was doing and some of the ideas and concepts he had in some of his work, we find that he actually, I think, did have a contribution and a legacy found very much in the actual technology of rocketry, and that this aspect of him has tended to be somewhat lost. It's a little bit, I think, like the story of the Wrights, where you have the Wrights create the first airplane, then many others go well beyond them and do many other things. And that results then in a tendency of people to look back at the Wrights and say, well, maybe they weren't all that influential. But then when you find, you go through that thesis, antithesis, and then you finally come back to a synthesis that says, actually, they were pretty good. They had done enough pretty much on their own, and they deserve all the credit they got. I think that the same is true very much for Goddard. And so with that in mind, I'll just give a quick review, which probably won't surprise anybody, about the life of Goddard and some of the interesting aspects of it, and show some visuals. And then beyond that, we'll go into the contributions that we can tie to him. And then I think we'll have a fairly interesting, wide-ranging discussion, no doubt, among ourselves. I would mention one individual that didn't come up in previous discussions on this meeting, and that's a very influential figure who now I think is one of those individuals who is increasingly forgotten. And that's Gus Pendray, G. Edward Pendray, co-founder of the American Rocket Society, which of course became one of the constituent elements of the basis of the AIAA, the ARS and the IAS coming together. Gus Pendray played a major role not only in the early history of American rocketry, but also was very much an early proponent of the tremendous work that he felt Goddard had done, and he played a very great role then in popularizing that work afterwards. It was Pendray that Esther Goddard got to help edit the multi-volume papers of Goddard, which are an indispensable reference. I was fortunate to know Pendray and met Esther Goddard on several occasions when she came by the Air and Space Museum back in the 70s, early 70s. And I must say Goddard was very fortunate. Esther Goddard was obviously a woman who had loved him very deeply, and she certainly carried the torch for him, and she did everything she possibly could to make certain that those who wished to treat Goddard in exhibits or whatnot got everything that she felt they needed to have. Fred Durant was head of astronautics in that time period, and the combination of Fred and Tom Crouch, who was a curator of astronautics then, and Frank Winter, supported by outsiders like Gene Emmy, the first and of NASA's historians, a very important man in his own right, I think certainly did well by Goddard. I would recommend for those listening that if you get a chance, get on A-Books, the used book selling service, and get yourselves, if you haven't seen it already, get yourselves a copy of a compilation issued in 1964 called The History of Rocket Technology, edited by Gene Emmy, with some extraordinary essays in there by people like Pendray and others who were themselves pioneers in the field of astronautics, or in the field, or sometimes both, of astronautics history. So now I'm going to fire up my own PowerPoint here and share it with you all. Now, can you all see that?
We are. It looks great.
Great. Excellent. Well, that's, of course, the classic hero shot, if you will, of Robert Goddard, how people choose to remember him. He looks less like an astronautics pioneer and more like he might have been an accountant or perhaps a university administrator or professor or something, completely happy within the academic environment, or at least away from the public. And I think, as Bill pointed out, when we look at Goddard in much more detail, we find that he was actually much more adept at interacting with the media. and seeking to get his message out through the media than people would think. Now, this story is told by laymen, and Pendray ascribed great importance to it as well. And that is that when young Goddard, at about age 16 or 17, was in his formative years, he had a visionary experience of seeing a spacecraft manifest itself while he was sitting in a cherry tree, and the spacecraft took off before his view. It's hard to know exactly what was going on here. It was clearly a vision, but did he have something else going on? Did he have, an epileptic seizure or something of that was a singular event or whatnot? But whatever it was, he recalled the date and the event with such great precision, and acknowledged its influence is so great that he acknowledged it every single year in his diary. And in 1938, when a hurricane blasted across New England and knocked down the tree, he wrote, "Cherry tree down, must carry on alone." And you think that's a pretty profound statement. At that point, of course, he was in his already in his 40s, but it showed how much that this event actually meant to him. What is intriguing is that although he was always interested in science and technology, and he came from a family that had appreciated, certainly in that Yankee industrial sense, giving his forebears technology and the application of technology, he very quickly seized on rocketry as a particular area of interest, and spaceflight more generally. And he was open to exploring all forms of propulsion. Very intriguing. He was looking at atomic energy, possible applications of atomic energy, possible applications of ion propulsion, chemical propulsion of various sorts. He was considering initially, of course, solid fuel rocketry, because that's what the world basically had experience of, and then turned to studying liquid fuel rockets. And his initial interest in liquid fuel rockets, oddly enough, he recognized very quickly that for an oxidized, the liquid oxygen was just about perfect. But then he thought maybe liquid hydrogen would make an ideal fuel. He was looking very much at the LOX-hydrogen combination, which of course became crucially important in space flight. But he recognized as well that it was a little too early to pursue that. And so he backed off and he looked at LOX and gasoline ultimately. Now, following on Bill's comment on Goddard's ability to work with the media, his initial pronouncements and papers gained a great deal of media attention. He had written a paper on a method of reaching extreme altitudes that was published as part of the Smithsonian Institution's Miscellaneous series, a series of technical reports and scientific reports that covered all the various fields of inquiry that the Smithsonian was interested in. Most of them were in the natural sciences in those days. But then he got very interested in the whole notion of possibly flying to the moon. And he really went a great distance. I see him as really leading the charge in many ways and laying out the challenges and the kind of prospects, scientific prospects, of actually creating a vehicle to pursue a journey to the moon and then return. In this way, he anticipated people like Walter Hohmann, and I think in his own way, he was going beyond the work of people that you would see, the other two great pioneers of astronautics, such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Hermann Oberth. The thing that I think really singles out Goddard is his great interest in actual flying experiments. And in this, he shares this very much with the Wright brothers, who went before him. So the comparison of Goddard and the Wrights including to perhaps even to use the term self-destructive aspects of their work, I think is completely appropriate. The more one looks in detail at what he did and his approach to the craft of astronautics. His first great work in this area, oddly enough, was a byproduct of American involvement in the First World War. The First World War broke out in 1914, of course. In 1917, we entered the war on the Allied side, and Goddard received support from the Smithsonian Institution to conduct some rocket research at Mount Wilson in California. And he needed an area to test some of his concepts of using rockets as weapons. Now, once again, he was looking very much at solid fuel rockets in the tradition of the Hale rocket and the Congreve rocket before it. But he was also looking to using a launcher tube and with a much more sophisticated rocket shape and nozzle shape. And if you take a look at this, the Army won the war using the conventional weaponry that it had at the time, won its part of the war, I should say. But what is intriguing is how this really anticipated the development of the battlefield rocket as we saw it emerge in the Second World War. There was some very significant work in that area in the late 1930s, particularly by the Russians, that showed up in Spain and in China and things like that. But by and large, the classic bazooka, the tank-killing bazooka of World War II, which was a critically important weapon, really we can trace the origins of that to Goddard's work in the First World War. Now, Goddard recognized very quickly that solid fuel rockets in those days were basically derivations of black powder rocket technology. And as a result, they simply weren't, the propellant was not energetic enough to really enable you to achieve the kind of performance that you needed if you were to escape the atmosphere. Something else was needed. And this was where he really started looking in detail at liquid fuels and liquid oxidizers. And that took him down the road, as I said initially, to looking at LOX hydrogen mixes, and then going beyond that to LOX gasoline mixes. And he determined to build a small, if you will, to use a later term, technology demonstrator that could demonstrate this. The kind of approach he took was not unique at the time. It was one that has fallen out of favor, except for extractive rocket systems, where you are trying to extract air crew or lift a capsule or a vehicle of some sort out of another vehicle. But he settled on what we call a repulsor, the rocket at the top, so to speak, and everything else down below. And this drawing that you have here, as you look at it, the horizontal rendering, is one that Goddard himself did for G. Edward Pendray, for a book that Pendray was writing on the coming age of rocket power in 1945, shortly before Goddard himself, of course, died. And it gives the basic layout. You see that you had the oxygen tank and the fuel tank at the bottom of the vehicle. Each had a separate line up to a mixing port at the very top of the rocket, where they were sprayed and injected via pressurized gas into the combustion chamber. And then, of course, you had the ignition of the rocket motor, and you'd be off on your flight. The drawing on the right shows a little more detail on this, and also shows the perspective of the rocket as it is sitting in the launching frame that he used. Now, Goddard was fortunate in that he had a relative, an Aunt Effie, who had a farm outside Worcester. And it was Aunt Effie's farm that became the first rocket test site that he used. This is of course, the classic photograph. I've counted today, as of this talk, 37 separate uses of it in articles and whatnot. So this is definitely the ultimate, if you will, in Goddard photographs, the one that will always be his signature snap, showing him at Aunt Effie's farm shortly before he launched it. Now, I noticed a lot of the accounts today said that the performance of this rocket was unspectacular, and that, implying that it's hard to believe that this event had any significance. And I would point out that the performance of the Wright brothers biplane was hardly spectacular as well on December 17, 1903. It's up in the air for a little over a couple of seconds, and it covers about 120 feet, depending on how you calculate it. Well, the flight duration of this was 2.5 seconds, ground track 184 feet, and that constitutes the so-called Kitty Hawk of rocketry. What's interesting is that what this and some subsequent tests did was bring him immediately a great deal of attention, and the attention brought welcome publicity that enabled him to enabled supporters to contact him and him to get some feedback on his work. But it also brought him a lot of ridicule, particularly a follow-on test flight in 1929 on July 17, where the rocket, and people looking at the early history of American rocketry in the 1950s launching out of the Cape will recognize this story, where a rocket took off and then hung an immediate right turn at about 50 or 100 feet, raced off several hundred feet, and then crashed and set fire to a field. That particular accident drew some scathing editorial comments from the New York Times and other newspapers, but it also brought him to the attention of Charles Lindbergh and the Guggenheims, particularly Daniel Guggenheim, the patriarch of the family, and his son, Harry Guggenheim, who had been the president of the earlier Daniel Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aviation from 1926 to 1930, which had really become a major influencer in establishing the profession of American aeronautical engineering. It had been under the auspices of that Guggenheim Fund that Theodore von Karman had been brought to Caltech, that Caltech indeed had received grants enabling it to set up the so-called Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, GALCET. There was an aeronautical grant to MIT, University of Michigan, University of Washington, Georgia School of Technology. So the Guggenheim largesse was very broadly based. What I don't think the Guggenheims appreciated when they set the original fund in motion was that as the fund was winding down, Daniel Guggenheim, who was still looking for things to support, even though his own health was very, very bad, at that point, he had very serious heart disease. The Guggenheims became more and more interested in extending flight. They had done what they thought they needed to do in promoting aeronautics, particularly aeronautical safety, aeronautical engineering, air transport, the development of blind flying instrumentation, solving the so-called problem of fog flying as it went. But now they were looking very much at anything else that might indicate a new area to turn to. The work of Goddard was brought to their attention over a Sunday brunch by Harry Guggenheim's wife of the time. And she suggested, this may be something that you'd all find interesting and something worth looking at. Now, Charles Lindbergh had been interested in rocketry for quite some time, but when he had gone around the propulsion industry, he had found that the propulsion industry and the explosive industry and people like that were not at all interested in pursuing rocketry at any level. They basically had their blinkers on. They were seeing it strictly in terms of skyrockets, signal flares, They did not consider it to have any military value because the cannon had gone well beyond the rocket in terms of rocket capabilities. And they, when asked to address the needs of big rockets, they thought in archaic terms. In fact, at one point, he was even informed that, well, we could develop large rockets, but would have to have very large combustion chambers, possibly even lined with brick or ceramic, in order for these engines to function. So Lindbergh decided to contact Goddard. He did so, met him, was very impressed by what he heard, and then he invited Goddard to fly with him to various industrialists to get their own view on what might be done to support rocket research. Once again, heard all the negative things, and instead at that point, Lindbergh became convinced that this was something in the tradition of what the Guggenheims had supported, recommended to Daniel Guggenheim that Guggenheim support rocketry, and Guggenheim began the first of what would be over $100,000 worth of grants to promote Goddard's work. $100,000 then, of course, basically you can multiply that by 20, and you get basically what that initial grant of 3 years support that Guggenheim gave Goddard, what that really meant. And on top of that, Goddard partnered with the Carnegie Institution, thanks to the intervention of Charles Lindbergh, to get some more money for him, and the Smithsonian as well, because of his old connections with the Smithsonian and some of the reports he had done. Now, there was another reason why Goddard needed this, and that was he had very bad health. He had a very serious tuberculosis condition that had set in as a child, and he had to leave for the Southwest. You know, in those days, basically, if you had lung issues, you found some way to get to the Southwest. And so basically in 1930, he relocates from New England to Roswell, New Mexico, purely coincidental, given all the interest in Roswell with UFOs later, et cetera. Although maybe conspiracy theorists would say it wasn't all that coincidental, given that if the aliens learned about it, undoubtedly, that's probably where they would have wanted to hang out. In any case, Goddard at Roswell showed some of the strengths and weaknesses of his approach to rocket technology. He had very wide-ranging interests and concerns in how rockets should be pursued. He recognized that you were dealing with a system, to use a later term, a system of systems approach. And you had to be concerned not only about the propulsion side of it, just getting them off the ground, but you had to be concerned with stability and control. Now, oddly enough, in this, he is mirroring exactly the Wright brothers. The Wrights had recognized early on, very, very prudently, that the big problem in flight was not generating enough power to get an airplane in the air. Once you got in the air, you had to be able to control it. You had to keep it stable somehow. You had to be able to control it in three-dimensional flight. And that actually was what took the greatest amount of effort on their part, was refining the airplane as a practical three-dimensional vehicle. And that's why that first flight of Kitty Hawk was so significant. Well, the same is true really with Goddard. All through the 1930s, Goddard builds rockets of increasing sophistication that have some remarkable features: gyrostabilization, thrust vectoring of the exhaust using vanes inserted into the exhaust flow. This photo of him here shows him at his launch control panel, which was located behind a very rudimentary shelter, located 1,000 feet away from his launch tower. Goddard was fortunate that he had a very good small team of people that he could draw upon to help build his rockets. This shows one of his later designs, and you can see very much that this gives him a hobby shop kind of environment. Now, at this time, we had, as Frank Winter documented many years ago, we had the development of, and Mike Neufeld then in much greater detail, looking exclusively at Nazi Germany. We had this very interesting development of international rocket societies. And these rocket societies were very significant in promoting an interest in high-speed flight. I don't think they were taken as seriously as they should have been, frankly, but they were certainly pointing us in the direction of transitioning from subsonic flight to supersonic flight, but beyond that, flight beyond the airplane, flight beyond winged flight, flight that would rely in the crossing of the common line, where you'd actually be following the laws of ballistics, Keplerian trajectories, things of this sort, Hohmann transfers. You would not be dealing with the traditional aerodynamics of lifting flight. Now, there's a place for lifting flight in space flight, and I think we've seen that demonstrated recently in some very interesting tests by the Boeing X-37B spacecraft in terms of some of its positioning itself for orbital maneuvering as part of some Space Force initiatives and things like that. But Goddard recognized that all these questions and others beyond them would be ones that had to be addressed. Now, because of this growing interest in all these communities, Goddard was subject to inquiries, people seeking to learn more about what he was doing. He picked and chose very carefully. He did select, because he felt he needed to, he did select the services of two people that he brought in to work with his original members. But he was also very concerned, and I think he shared this with the right, certainly, he was very concerned with his ideas being ripped off. And so when Theodor von Karman and the powerhouse team that he had assembled at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory came knocking, Goddard basically was not terribly supportive of having much contact with them. Frank Molina, a von Karman contronaut and a very powerful, influential figure in the early years of American rocketry, particularly on the jet propulsion laboratory side of things and the Army side of things, went to visit him. So did A.M.O. Smith from the Douglas Corporation. A.M.O. Smith was a classically trained aerodynamicist who played a very influential role in the early history of American supersonic flight from the Douglas perspective. But basically, Goddard, although very polite and very gracious, he really didn't give up any secrets, if you will, and really give them any detailed showing of what was going on. Now, that concerned the Guggenheims. The Guggenheims, by this time, Daniel Guggenheim had died. He had died shortly after making the Goddard grant, in fact. But this concerned Harry Guggenheim, who had returned from being ambassador to Cuba when Roosevelt was elected and took office in 1933. Harry tendered his resignation. He had been a Hoover appointee. And so Harry, returning more closely to the fold in terms of its interests, basically was wondering what's up with Goddard. And so in 1935, he scheduled a site visit. And this shows the Guggenheim site visit to Goddard at Roswell, 1935. He brought along Charles Lindbergh, who was still a great confidant of Harry Guggenheim all throughout these years, and indeed through and after the Second World War, despite the strain that Guggenheim had with Lindbergh over his positions with the America First movement. And you see here from left to right, Albert Kisk, who was actually a brother-in-law of Robert Goddard. You had then Goddard himself in the center, Lindbergh, the tallest guy here. As Bill Barry said before the presentation, it's easy to see why his nickname was Slim. You have Harry Guggenheim nattily dressed in a suit. He must have been roasting in that environment out there. And then Niels Lundquist on the right, who was one of his chief fabrication people. Behind him, You have them at the base of the launch tower with the tail cone and fins of one of the rockets visibly there. Now, the Guggenheims wished that Goddard would expand his contacts, particularly as rumors surfaced of work being done overseas by other countries, particularly by Nazi Germany with rocketry. It was not to be. Even so, it did not cause any break in their relationship. They continued to support him until Goddard left Roswell in October 1941 to join the Navy as a civilian scientist working at Annapolis, Maryland, working on rocket propulsion. The Navy was very interested in using large rocket engines of one sort or another to help boost large seaplanes off the water. There's a phenomenon that you have with seaplane hulls operating on still water, where you can create such very strong frictional forces that you have a negative lift formed, and a seaplane can actually be pulled down into the water and broken up. This was a problem. It was encountered not rarely, more common than people would think. And so the Navy was very interested in looking at rocket propulsion as a means of kicking seaplanes off the surface of the water very quickly. They went down a different road than many of the areas that Goddard was interested in. And nevertheless, having said that, by 1945, if you take a look at operational footage from the Navy on their seaplane operations, particularly in the Western Pacific, you see that the use of rockets to get off still waters was very common. Goddard, having moved back from New Mexico to the Tidewater, Goddard's health continued to deteriorate. Worse, on top of this, he developed a throat cancer. I have not been able to find whether or not Goddard smoked, but if he smoked, that would have possibly triggered a common problem with throat cancer among people who have tuberculosis. But whatever, he went into the hospital in June of 1945 for what was considered to be a routine operation. While he was there, things deteriorated rapidly, and he died August 10 in a coma in 1945 at age 62. So he basically lasted through the Second World War. So what can we actually say about his accomplishments? Well, in the early 1960s, Gus Pendray put together a list of them, and I've taken a look at them, and I find that actually Pendray did a very good job in enumerating these. I don't necessarily agree with the order that he put them in, and so I put others in and established my own order here. I think first and foremost, you have this popularization of rocketry and spaceflight. We can say that and we can throw that out, and it just becomes a commonplace, and people don't think what that really means. But here you had a degreed physicist, a man of accomplished scientific training, who actually gave rocketry scientific respectability. You had in the late 1890s, in the invention of the airplane, you had Samuel Langley, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, who ostensibly had scientific respectability and gave for a while, gave aeronautics some measure of respectability, but he really didn't understand the basic problem of flight. And when his work developing large flying machines, the so-called Langley aerodromes, when that met with failure twice in a row, the fact that he had this failure basically did much more harm to the prospects of the airplane than it otherwise would have. Well, with Goddard never had that failure. He had developmental challenges, and he would have the occasional accident, if you will, but he had a record of demonstrating that what he said worked. The second thing he did was he did put down markers. He did put down a scientific record of papers and inquiries and prognostications that were very important and very encouraging to follow on pioneers. And Bill Barry did an excellent job in summarizing the historiography of the views pro and con on Goddard. But I find it very interesting that if you go back and don't look at the historians, if you go back and take a look at the actual rocket pioneers from the time and what they say, they all pay at least lip service to Goddard, not only for giving it scientific respectability, but also pointing the way and pointing out what needed to be accomplished and how it should be accomplished. That point on the first detailed analysis using rockets for high altitude flight and for escaping Earth's gravity, that gained tremendous press attention, most of it negative. But to those in the know, on the other hand, it presented a future vision that was compelling. He was the first to patent the concept of multi-stage rockets in 1914. He was the first to test liquid propellant rocket engines that were practical and useful. As I mentioned, he started out thinking of LOX hydrogen and then moved on to LOX gasoline. He was the first to successfully fly a liquid propellant rocket. That, of course, is why we're having this event tonight. Over the roughly a dozen years, he flew a total of 34 rockets. He was the first to demonstrate gyro stabilization of a rocket in 1932. And then, as I mentioned, his work, he was the first to use exhaust gas deflectors to stabilize and control rockets during their ascent. There is one significant contribution he made that was influential on the post-World War II heritage of rocketry or development of rocketry. Now, traditionally, we've seen Goddard as strictly a creature of the 20s and early 30s. We haven't given much thought to him beyond that point. But if you take a look at his work with the Navy, he was very interested in pursuing the notion of a throttleable rocket engine that could be throttled in flight. And the concept that he had, the hardware that he utilized for his experiments, was exploited after the war by the Curtiss-Wright Corporation for their XLR-25 rocket engine that was used on the Bell X-2, the world's first Mach 3 airplane. It reached Mach 3 September 27, 1956. Sadly, on that flight, due to aerodynamic phenomenon called inertial coupling, the plane was lost during a turn back to base, Edwards Air Force Base, and the test pilot, Milburn Apt, was sadly lost. Although he tried to escape the aircraft, he could not get out before it crashed. But that in-flight throttleable rocket engine that Curtiss-Wright pioneered set the marker for subsequent throttleable rocket engines, most significantly the XLR-99 engine of Thiokol, which was employed in the X-15. And then, of course, we used throttleable rocket engines from that point on in space flight. We've all heard the command time for throttle up or whatever it is when we're taking a look at launches of things like the space shuttle or other advanced launch systems. The space shuttle now, of course, being retired up to the present day. So we take a look at this, and I think we can say that the contributions of Goddard to spaceflight were indeed significant. I think that if we take a look at Goddard and the overall views on Goddard and his contributions, we could do no better than to quote from Frank Winter, whose name has been taken in vain here several times tonight. Frank Winter, a legendary curator of rocketry at the National Air and Space Museum, extraordinary guy, familiar to AIAA members since the 1960s for some of his work in the history of rocketry, and tremendously prolific in his publications. He wrote in an article that just came out this month in Quest Magazine, Volume 33, Number 1, 2026, he wrote, In the final analysis, in spite of his secrecy, uncooperativeness, and other flaws, Goddard was a brilliant, complex, and creative man, and in the forefront of the history of both rocketry and spaceflight. As expressed by Clary, despite all, he was undeniably America's first rocket scientist, the most heavily publicized in the world, and a towering figure in the history of modern technology, whose real accomplishments should have been enough to make legend building unnecessary. Winter goes on. I contend that by the same token, Goddard made spaceflight respectable in those early years, considering he was a physicist and his rocketry work toward that goal was supported by the venerated Smithsonian Institution and later the Guggenheim Foundation. Whereas before, spaceflight, and he emphasizes this, was only a fantasy, an impossibility. Indeed, he played a major role in transforming it, an impossibility. Indeed, he played a major role in transforming it into a possibility. His story is therefore one of the most paradoxical ones in the history of technology. Thank you all very, very much.
Dick, that was brilliant. Thank you. Everyone, this is Walter Gordon back. We're going to be taking questions from the via the Q&A tab. We already have two. Feel free to type more. If you want to direct it towards a specific person, feel to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the panelists to jump in as appropriate. So we have one here from John Blanton on the AIAA History Committee. One school of thought about both Goddard and the Wright brothers is that their efforts in the courts to restrict rivals severely hampered the advancement of the state-of-the-art in the United States. Please comment. Oh, Dick, you're muted. Dick, you muted yourself.
First of all, thank you, John, for that question. That's a very thoughtful question, and one that I'm glad you raised. I think it's quite clear that that was true for the Wrights. You know, I'm fond of saying that the Wrights tried to control technology by appealing to the courts, but the only way, and by doing that, preserving their technology and their technological advantage. But the only way you preserve technology is by moving on, you know, and moving to the next step. And unfortunately, they didn't do that. And all that really did was really tie us up so that by World War I, we were all flying other people's airplanes. I don't see that that's particularly true in the case of Goddard, but I do think that the recollection of the Wright patent controversies, which led to the NACA's first significant act, namely a cross-licensing patent agreement in 1917 with the Manufacturers Aircraft Association to end this logjam of suits and countersuits. I think that perception and that experience sensitized the burgeoning astronautics industry, if you will, that they needed to really do something. And there was another issue, and that was, I think, basic fairness. There wasn't really that issue with the Wrights, but there certainly was that issue, I think, with Esther Goddard and Robert Goddard. This guy really had put his entire life into this, and you know, nobody would ever say that the Goddards were living high off the hog, so to speak, down in the wilds of Eden Valley, New Mexico.
Okay, we have another very interesting one that I don't know if any of our participants will be able to answer, but I'm really curious from Chris Cohan from UB. How were rocket fuels, particularly LOX, produced in those days, and how did Goddard get it? Can anyone talk to that?
I have to confess, I can't answer that question knowledgeably, to be honest about it.
Yeah, and anybody else in the group?
It was available. It was certainly available in a university environment, but now that you mention it, he must have had some means of doing that in New Mexico, and that eludes me.
Yeah. question from Paul King, and I'm just going to throw it out there. Apologies for the loaded question, but what are the impacts of closing down the library at NASA Goddard? Bill, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I, I don't know. I retired from NASA 5 years ago, so I'm not in on what's going on at the moment there. But I can say that the plan had been, thanks to Chris Scolese, actually, the Goddard was establishing a history program, and the first step of that was to build an archive, and that archive was established in the library building, and so the key to the whole Goddard history program was the library. And as I understood it, um, about the time I was retiring, Goddard developed a plan for rebuilding the campus because the facilities were built in the early 60s, largely in a hurry, right? And so there's a need to refresh the campus. And so there was a long-term plan that was supposed to be built out through the 1930 into the 2030s about to rebuild the things. And one of the buildings that was on the list not to actually be replaced was the library because it was going to be, it's got some very heavy flooring, lots of other reasons not to do it. So the plan was that that building would stay and that the archive would stay in there at the library. Um, my understanding is that the current administration has decided that that building is going to be closed, and it's not unclear, what happens there. And so, in addition to the library, which is an incredible resource in itself, and has quite a collection of invaluable works that would be hard to find anywhere else. Um, in addition to the library going, the history program is called into question as too, as far as I know. But like I said, um, I don't. I've been retired for 5 years. I don't know. I don't know the current details of that. You'd have to ask somebody that works at NASA these days if you get them to answer the question, and if they even know what the answer to the question is. So I'm not sure what happens with the library. There are, I understand, donations that were made by Esther Goddard that were in the library. I think those are being saved, um, but who knows? And if anybody else has anything else to say about it, I'd be happy to cede the floor to them. Chris, maybe you have some answers.
I don't have any answers. I did, when I heard about it, I did ask, and they said they were going to preserve the historical documents, which there are quite a few. As you said, Esther Goddard had provided some, and over the years, um, as I think you know, Bill, the other people donated, um, Goddard letters and memorabilia, which were and hopefully still are housed there until they find a safe place for them. But in addition to that, there was a lot of, particularly from the early days, documentation about those early explorer missions and the OAO missions and various others. Landsat, a lot of Landsat data was there. Tyros. So there's a wealth of knowledge in those stacks. And Bill knows when I was there and he was at headquarters, we got an archivist and we actually remodeled the library to fix it, and it actually won Library of the Year. And the archivist, pulled, because it was such a large holding, we took any duplicates and made those available and started digitizing things, but we preserved the originals to the extent that they were preservable. And hopefully we have digital copies of everything. But I have lost track of it since I left. They tell me they're going to protect it, though. All I can say is we'll see. Yeah.
I was muted. I was trying to talk. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Chris. Uh, yeah, very sad. Hopefully they'll save as much as possible. Another question. To what extent did Werner von Braun and his team draw from Goddard's patents and other available information? Dick, you want to take that?
Yeah, I will. I'm just firing myself up here. Stand by.
Sure. There we go. We got you.
Okay. Oh, you got me. Good. Okay. Actually, there was a question, a relative, kind of a similar question I noticed by Bill Strandberg at the NRO CSNR. What factors, government or individual, drive from von Braun and others in Germany led to their large support of liquid rockets, vice the lack of support here in the U.S.? Two very, very interesting questions. On the first one, both within the NASA history archives transcripts of the Apollo era von Braun engineering team, and from their own writings, recognizing one has to be careful that some of this can be simply a politeness. Oh, yes, we learned from Goddard. We did a whole lot of things thanks to Goddard. You find them paying lip service to Goddard. I would say, actually, that they moved rapidly beyond Goddard because they simply had what Bill Strandberg hinted at, and that was a tremendously energetic research, development, test, and evaluation process focusing on developing the facilities, the support infrastructure, the materials infrastructure, the propulsion infrastructure, whatever they needed to do to get the job done, particularly when they put the Peenemünde complex together. That was a tremendous leg up on getting them to the point where they could undertake the basic research, development, test, and evaluation to develop a large rocket. And especially when they could get away, once they got away from little makeshift Raketenflugplatz operations like Kummersdorf West and places like that. Now, having said that, there's kind of an irony here. The U.S. government did not really evince any interest in supporting large rocketry at that time because actually it really didn't need to. We had tremendous means of power projection. We had other things we were concerned about. We were, of course, in the midst of a huge depression that we were working our way through. The irony for Nazi Germany is that that was not really what they should have been devoting their attention to as well. Oddly enough, had they been more concerned with developing smaller rockets using the technology base they developed for their larger rockets, the smaller rockets would have had a much greater payoff. Had they devoted more attention to long-range battlefield rocket artillery, had they devoted more attention to surface-to-air missiles. If you take a look at the power projection, I mean, there was a reason why there was major differences between the Allied strategic bombing campaign, both British and American, against Nazi Germany, and the German strategic attack campaign against, for example, Great Britain. The V-2, and for that matter, the V-1 cruise missile, had nowhere near the accuracy needed to make a significant military impact. They were by nature the only thing they could be. They could only be terrorist weapons. At least when Bomber Command or 8th Air Force or 15th Air Force were out to attack a target in Germany or wherever, they did have aiming points, and they were doing their best with the bomb sites of the day to try to put bombs around that or on that aiming point. Now, by the standards of today, their accuracy was woeful, but by the standards of that time, it was a lot better than a 200-mile or a 180-mile V-2 blasting off and managing to land somewhere in London, or a V-1 managing to land somewhere in South London, typically nowhere near anything of value. It was very much like we see Iran doing today when they're just blasting off what theater ballistic missiles they have in whatever direction they're going. Although we do see that in some cases they're able to do some fairly sophisticated guidance, at least with specialized versions of the missiles they're using. So you could say that the German missile program, and by the way, anyone interested in the German missile program has to consult two foundational books. And the foundational books are, first of all, they're both by Mike Neufeld. One is The Rocket and the Reich, a superb book. And then the second is his biography of Werner von Braun. Von Braun, dreamer of space, engineer of war, if I recall the title correctly. They're absolutely essential works. And they cut through a lot of the myths of German rocketry as well. But, you know, you might say that Germany had this mixed up approach to its research and development, where it was not able to adequately manage its research and development enterprise to do anything it really needed. It never really developed operationally in large numbers a fighter to replace the Messerschmitt 109 or the FW-190 that succeeded it. Even the 262 was not built in anywhere near the numbers that it needed to get the job done. It never really developed a decent long-range bomber. And the missiles would have only made sense if you had a viable atomic weapon program, but they would have needed the micro-miniaturization that came in the 1950s. You could say that Nazi Germany was prepared to win the war of 1960, but it certainly wasn't prepared to win the war of 1944-45.
Thanks, Dick. And I've known Dr. Hallion for a long time, and I hope some of you who don't know him so well are beginning to appreciate the depth and breadth of what is between those ears. And if I sound like I'm in awe, it's because I am. Moving on. Question from Mike Mikowski, immediate past chair of the AIAA History Committee. Everybody has seen Goddard's first rocket. Are there photos of his later designs? You know, how far were they developed? How well is it documented?
Mike, the place you might look is the Aerospace Museum's webpage. They've got a collection of pictures of the artifacts they have, and they have a very nice collection of Goddard rockets there. So I don't know, Dick, do you have other suggestions there?
No, actually, that's excellent, Bill. I used one of them in this PowerPoint, which, by the way, anybody who wants it, I can send you a PDF of it if you just contact me. But he basically moved rapidly beyond the repulsor idea to a much more, what we would say now would be a much more traditional approach of having the tail groupings for stabilization in the back end, the rocket in the back end, et cetera. He showed a high appreciation for streamlining and a cylindrical body approach. He did not go for the rounded ogival body shaping that we saw with the Germans with the V2. But then again, after World War II, we didn't really go with that. We didn't see the world go with that approach. You know, basically we adopted the, if you will, the cylindrical approach. You know, if you take a look at a Redstone missile and compare it to a V2, the Redstone, the Jupiter C, you know, all those are basically bodies of revolution. And the same for the Soviet ballistic missiles of Korolev and others as well.
Sorry, I was muted looking at the questions. Next one, I read the compilation of Goddard's papers that are available on the Clark website, but found them not very technical. What is a good book or other compilation that captures his technical work in detail? Is there such a thing?
I have to say that I don't know of the best I would recommend is going to his collection of his papers, just like the best source in the Wrights of the Wright brothers' papers themselves. I don't know of a single author that has looked at Goddard in terms of his technical work by going through it in detail. The Wright brothers were fortunate to have two people who looked at their work in technical depth. One of them was John Anderson, and the other was Peter Jacob, whose book on the Wrights, Visions of a Flying Machine, is absolutely essential. It's written with an engineer's eye, as indeed Peter is. If you take a look at the uh, Goddard books, uh, they start out with the laudatory Milton Layman's book, which, by the way, is still a very useful book. The analogy I'd make, I think, is with a British scientist named Barnes Wallis, who was the inventor of the so-called bouncing bomb in World War II. He invented geodetic structures as applied to aircraft with the Vickers Wellesley, and then later, more famously, with the Vickers Wellington. And then after World War II, was involved with a concept called Swallow, which was an early early dual pivot variable wing sweep concept that got a great deal of attention from thanks to John Stack of NASA with Langley Research Center in the late 1950s, early 1960s. If you take a look at Wallace, he was the subject of a very fine biography by a man named J.E. Morpurgo. More recently, there's been a book on Wallace that has taken a look at him in a much more detailed sense in terms of his actual technical work and technical accomplishments. So it's I think, to anyone listening who might want to take up the challenge, Goddard is still, I think, and will be for quite a while, still a fruitful subject for further work.
Dick, since you brought up Barnes Wallis, Bill, I'll let you go in a second. But since you brought up Barnes Wallis, I just have to jump in. Of course, he was the man behind the R100.
Yes, exactly.
Which was, for those who don't know, the British made two world-class dirigibles along the lines of the Akron, the Macon, the Hindenburg, and so forth. And one was successful and one wasn't. This is in the early 30s. And Barnes Wallis, along with Neville Shute Mariner, the author, who was an aeronautical engineer at the time, were the brains behind the R100. And I apologize to everyone. I'm an airship geek, and I just had to mention that. Bill, please jump back in with what you were going to say.
Well, not that I wouldn't want to interrupt the airship geek anyway, but just to follow on to what Dick said, The Papers of Robert H. Goddard is the title of the book you're looking for. It's actually a 3-volume thing there, published January 1st, 1970. It was extremely expensive when it came out, and so there probably aren't many copies out there other than in the libraries. I did a quick look, and there's a used copy of the 3-volume set on Amazon for $300. So that is out there somewhere in some places, but library is probably the best shot for finding that. And I'm not sure how technical that actually is. So,
yeah. Dick, we had a question in the chat you said people could reach out to you. We had a question, how could they do that?
That's to me, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay. My email I just sent off, I'm posting it in chat if I'm doing this correctly.
Not yet, but you could be working on it.
I've noticed that at least on my chat thing, I can't access the entire webinar chat. Only the other people that are in.
Okay, I'll spell it out.
Yeah, I can post it.
Okay, you post it. Great, and it's the Florida Mock Scribe address.
Yep. Here you go. It's coming down, everybody. I'll also bring up, since Guggenheim was such a big part of your talk, Dick. If I'm remembering correctly, you presented a great Guggenheim talk with accompanying paper at AIAA SciTech this past year.
Yes.
And I was wondering if anyone asked if you would be willing to send them that paper rather than pay the $40 to AIAA.
I did get one request.
Okay. Yeah, so he wrote a terrific paper on the Guggenheims and what they did for aerospace. I would encourage anyone interested in that part of the story to try and get a copy from him or someone else.
I'll tell you what, if people send me an email, I'll send them both.
Yeah.
Yeah, such a deal, 2 for 1.
Question from Kevin Burns, past chairman of the AIAA History Committee, to Dick Hallion. Was there any transition from Goddard's work in Roswell to the work of the Hermes program with the captured V-2 rockets at White Sands?
It would have been nice. The answer is no. And the reason is that by that time, Goddard had left Roswell. And of course, he died right literally the day after the second atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. And of course, Japan didn't surrender until later in the month. So he did not make the end of World War II. We can say effectively that he did. And of course, Hermes was a program of the late 1940s located at White Sands. You do have connections between White Sands and Roswell, and they show up in the Astronautics Museum, the Space Museum that's at Alamogordo, which, by the way, is quite good. I would say, however, that the early history of rocketry at White Sands has been so dominated by the German narrative that people forget how much genuine American rocketry started there. And for that reason, I recommend very strongly, because it's a fascinating memoir, that you get hold of an old book by Milton Rosen, R-O-S-E-N, called The Viking Rocket Story from the 1950s. It'll probably cost you all of $5 on Abe Books, but it's well worth doing. It's an excellent, excellent book looking at the early testing and test environment at White Sands. By the way, if any of you are in the Las Cruces area, or even if you're much further north, up around Albuquerque, please do go and see the Missile Museum, Rocketry and Missile Museum at White Sands. It is not to be missed. It is astonishing, some of the vehicles that they have there in the museum, and even some of the archival holdings and photographs are well worth going and visiting. It's an excellent, excellent museum.
Yeah, I've been to that missile park many, many years ago, and it was spectacular at the time. That was 1985. I can't imagine what it is now.
Yeah, it's amazing.
We have a question on the design of that first rocket. Can someone elaborate on why Goddard put the thrust chamber on top instead of on the bottom? Was this a center of gravity, center of pressure consideration, something else? As a kid, I could never figure out the design.
I will just venture a guess that I think he thought that would be a neat way to have a rocket, essentially, if you will, pulling the rest of the vehicle off the pad. He was not alone in this. If you take a look, there were many early rocket concepts for repulsor type rockets. And of course, as I mentioned, if you take a look at the escape tower on Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, other vehicles that people have developed, other vehicles overseas, you see that it's not unknown to use that kind of approach. Or for that matter, in the flight safety world, if you take a look at the stencil, the so-called stencil ejection seat used on the old A1 in Southeast Asia, it was basically a rocket that pulled the pilot out of the plane via cables, right out of the seat. Boom, gone, you're out of here. So it is not typically what one would expect, but it was perhaps quirky, but it was not a bad concept.
And what might be the last question from Paul King, retired Moog. Were the Goddard theories influential on the von Braun multi-stage approach to lunar missions?
I would say only in the sense that Goddard had demonstrated and patented the notion of the multi-stage rocket, and therefore had shown its potentialities. The multi-stage rocket itself was one that by 1945 the Germans were working on. They had plans for an A9 and A10 that would have been, if memory serves me correct, transatlantic
Mhm.
boosted vehicles. But if you take a look, the first multi-stage rocket was actually the so-called Bumble Whack, which was a modified V2 flown in the United States using a JPL developed Whack Corporal rocket mounted on top of the V2. And one of those in 1949 became the first rocket system to achieve hypersonic flight.
Yeah. Uh, okay, I think that's it with the questions. We advertise this as going to 8:30. I can't believe how close we're coming to that. Um, I just did I? I just sent the email address of the AIAA Niagara Frontier Section. This talk has been recorded. If you would like a link to the recording to review it, or for someone that you think would enjoy the talk who couldn't make it, please send a request to that email address. If you would like to be put on our mailing list for future talks, if you're not already, we do usually have Zoom talks once a month. And our one next month is a most unusual speaker for us. Congressman Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, retired Air Force One star, was a bigwig at Offutt Air Force Base, is going to talk to us about some topic related to American defense. And with that, if our speakers could just unmute and unvideo so we could show them our appreciation. And this has been really terrific. And I appreciate your time, gentlemen, for truly, I think, a unique talk with the three of you regarding Robert Goddard on this 100th anniversary. So thank you very much, and perhaps see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye, all.